So the Utah Jazz have just been eliminated from the playoffs by the LA Clippers in 6 games in the second round. And going into this series versus the Clippers, I honestly thought that the Jazz would win this series. Not gonna lie, they really did disappoint me with their play in the last 4 games, especially with the Clippers missing Kawhi Leonard. And now this is obviously leading to a bunch of people calling the Utah Jazz frauds and all things like that. If I'm being honest, I think there are just certain things in certain games that didn't go in their favor, and they could have easily have won this series. Maybe not easily, but they could have won it. Because if Terrence Mann doesn't score nearly 40 points, Utah is forcing a game 7 at home, and anything can happen in that situation. And I think that it's clear in this series we saw a lot of problems with this Utah Jazz roster, and in today's video I'm going to be pointing out the problems, and then I'm going to be talking about how the Jazz can fix those problems. Before we get into the video, I ask you to drop a like on this video as it does help my channel grow. Subscribe to my channel if you want weekly NBA content, and touch my goal of 1,500 subscribers. Comment on this video, start a conversation with me as I do respond to all of my comments, and play that intro. The first and most obvious problem the Utah Jazz have might be Rudy Gobert. And this may sound kind of dumb since Rudy's the second best player on this team and he's the most impactful defender in the whole NBA. How can he be the problem? But if you watch the series, and especially in that game 6, Rudy's defense against small ball lineups to a certain point turned into a liability because Gobert cannot guard the perimeter and he's not fast enough to close out to open shooters. So when the Clippers ran a full lineup of 5 guys on the court who could shoot and dribble with no traditional center, it forced Rudy Gobert to guard Terrence Mann, and throughout the whole game, Gobert is only elite at protecting the rim, so he decided to stay in the paint, and that led to Terrence Mann getting a bunch of wide open 3-pointers, and he nearly hit all of them. And whenever Rudy was forced to guard the perimeter, he constantly kept on getting cooked. And if I'm being honest, this isn't a complete blame on Rudy, since it was obvious going into this game the Jazz had a plan to leave a shooter open, and they decided to leave Terrence Mann open, which probably back then was probably the smartest decision when they made it. And the problem is the fact that Rudy's a great defender, but he's only great at protecting the rim, and the fact that the Jazz have no other player who could play a small ball 5, and it basically means they have to do their traditional starting 5. They can't change it up or anything. They live or die with Rudy in the paint. And the problem is that teams on offense are getting wide open shots because Gobert doesn't want to guard the perimeter. And then when it's the Jazz's turn to score, Rudy Gobert has no post move, so he can't even score on a smaller defender. And this will constantly be the hindrance of the Jazz if they never fix it. I'm not saying they need to trade Gobert or anything, but all I'm saying is they need to get another option at center that could play the small ball 5, because it's so easy to game plan for them. And in my opinion, what they should do is look into a player who could play the small ball 5 lineup, because under their current roster, if they were gonna ever do that, they would have to run a guy like Bogdanovich, George Niang, or Joe Ingles at that position. And to be honest, I don't think those guys would be amazing at doing that. But during the free agency, the Jazz should look into getting a guy who could do that at even a decent level. Maybe they could look into getting Kelly Olynyk, who's a guy who's pretty good at guarding the perimeter when compared to Rudy Gobert. He's not amazing or anything, and he would probably make you worse on defense in those situations, but at least on offense he could space the floor, whereas Gobert wouldn't be able to take advantage of that matchup. I'm not saying Kelly's perfect for this position, but I think he might be better than Gobert, and with him at least they could do a full lineup of shooting. Maybe they could look into getting JaMychal Green, who I think would be a perfect small ball 5, because he's literally perfect, since he can guard the perimeter at a good level, and he can also space the floor, and he can get physical and get bored. Maybe they could go at looking at getting Bobby Portis from the Bucks, because although I think the Bucks are gonna want to re-sign him, I think he could be just as good as JaMychal Green is, because he can actually take advantage of the height mismatch. Maybe they could look into a guy like Stanley Johnson, who has the strength to guard a lot of big men in the NBA, and there's just a bunch of guys who could play that role. Maybe even Trevor Ariza, although I would question if he could do it at his old age. But nonetheless, the Jazz need a guy who could play the small ball 5 in critical moments. Imagine if they had someone who could play the small ball 5 in that game 6, they would honestly have won that game. Put JaMychal Green or Bobby Portis on this team and make them play the small ball 5, I guarantee you the Jazz win the series. It's just a little fix, but I think it would make them way better. The second problem I noticed with the Utah Jazz was the fact that although everyone knows Utah's a good defensive team and consider them one, because they actually are a good defensive team, an underrated problem with them is the fact that Utah's not actually a team filled with amazing defenders. The only reason they're a top 10 defense is the fact that Gobert carries their whole defense. And I somewhat feel bad for Gobert because just because he's the defensive player of the year, people feel like he should block every single shot and never get scored on and things like that. And to a certain degree, it's not completely his fault because in that game 6 versus the Clippers were getting past Utah's first man of defense way too easily, and it just messed up their whole defense because it caused them to have to rotate and it left certain players out of position and things like that. And it's a pretty difficult problem to have since a lot of the players who are getting blown by quickly are guys who they can't simply trade or get rid of, since those guys are very important on the offensive side of the floor. So maybe it's a matter of they just give more effort, or maybe they need to add 1 or 2 better perimeter defenders to the team. Because if you didn't realize, this Jazz team is literally just Rudy Gobert, who's an elite defender, and then there's Royce O'Neal, who's a pretty solid defender. And then outside of them, there's a bunch of below average or at best average defenders in guys like Mike Conley, Bogdan Bogdanovic, Joe Ingles, Donovan Mitchell, and others. They don't have any guys who can go out there and lock down another player or just do a really good job. Some guys they could look into this offseason that could play the perimeter defense pretty good is a guy like Josh Richardson, who's a really good perimeter defender. Stanley Johnson of the Raptors is a very good perimeter defender, and his three-point shot has been improving, so I think he could be a guy who could play pivotal minutes for them. Maybe they could get PJ Tucker from the Bucks, although I do think he's going to stay in Milwaukee. Maybe they could look into getting Avery Bradley, who was one of the better perimeter defenders in the whole league a few years ago. Maybe they could look into getting Maurice Harkless, who's a solid and tall defender. Maybe they could look into getting Torrey Craig, who's actually a really good defender. But nonetheless, the Jazz definitely need to look into getting more defenders, because especially in the postseason against teams with multiple players who can go off the dribble at a great level, they're constantly going to get exposed because Rudy Gobert can't block every single shot and he can't contest every single shot. And if a guy like Paul George or Kawhi is just blowing by you every time, you're going to get a lot of easy shots and like force the defense to do unnecessary rotations, and it's just going to put a lot of pressure on your defense that you wouldn't have if you had some better defenders originally. So this offseason, I think the Jazz need to looking to getting better perimeter defenders, and just getting 1 or 2 of those guys can make a significant difference. The third problem with the Utah Jazz is the fact that during this series, their coach and Quinn Snyder missed out on many adjustments that they should have made. And please don't get it twisted, Quinn Snyder should not be fired. I think he's one of the better coaches in the whole NBA, and my only problem with him is that in that game 6 and throughout the series, he missed out on many adjustments. Because when Terrence Mann was being defended by Rudy Gobert and he was getting open threes and he was constantly hitting all of his open threes, I believe Snyder should have either put Gobert on the bench and put in another perimeter player who could actually defend him. But if I'm being honest, I don't think that would have helped, since the paint would have still been open and guys like PG could have just drived in there and got easy buckets. And especially since, as I said, Utah's initial defenders were pretty bad, but maybe they should have at least tried it. But if you don't think they should have tried it, what they should have done was maybe change like who Gobert was guarding and leave a different player open. Because if a guy like Terrence Mann is on fire from 3, I don't think you should just leave him open. Maybe you should leave someone else on the court open who's not playing as good. Quinn's game was literally to leave the Clippers role players open and like hope that they wouldn't miss easy shots. And in the playoffs, I don't think that's a scheme that's gonna work. I think that adjustment could have saved them the game, but this is just a small nitpick. I don't think it's a huge deal, and I don't think it's going to be a huge deal like some of the other coaches. I hope Quinn Snyder isn't a coach like Mike Budenholzer where he doesn't make adjustments, but it's just something I realize, and I feel like they could have won the series and that game at least if they made more adjustments. But to conclude the video, this definitely was not a bad season from the Jazz as they got the number 1 seed, and it was a little bit disappointing to see them lose, but I still think they are a decent number 1 seed, and I think if they made a few adjustments in that series versus the Clippers, or some things just went their way, they definitely could have won that series. But I think this front office needs to add more pieces. I don't think they should make a huge trade or anything like that, but they should definitely be looking to add better perimeter defenders to their team, and some defenders that could play a small ball 5, because I think it would take this team to the next level. But the Jazz are fine right now, but if they have another disappointing season like this, I think they should be a little bit concerned about whether or not Donovan Mitchell's gonna stay. Anyways, guys, that's it for the video. Let me know whether or not you think the Jazz were a legitimate number 1 seed. Drop a like on this video to help my channel grow. Subscribe to my channel if you want weekly NBA content and touch my goal of 1,500 subscribers. Comment on this video, start a conversation with me, as I do respond to all of my comments, and I'm out.